Buddha's most often quoted words are the ones that Chris just read for us. Hatreds do not ever cease in this world by hating, but by love, and this is an eternal truth. And Jesus' words are a little more specific and perhaps more challenging even. You've heard that it was said in the past, an eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth, but I tell you, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. If someone takes your coat, offer him your shirt too. Martin Luther King Jr. said, in order to love the enemy, we must at all times seek to win his friendship and understanding rather than defeat or humiliate him. In fact, King would go on to say that this command of Jesus to love your enemies is an absolute necessity for the survival of civilization. Now, let's be real for a moment. Okay. Few of us are moral superheroes. But I'll tell you this, those looking from the outside in on Christianity see loving our enemies as a core tenet of the Christian faith, and we are judged accordingly. How do you think we're doing? Jesus occupies in my heart, said Gandhi, the place of one of the greatest teachers who have had a considerable influence on my life. I shall say to the Hindus that your life will be incomplete unless you reverentially study the teachings of Jesus. And for Gandhi, the heart of Jesus' teaching was forgiveness, nonviolence, and loving enemies. Now, this wasn't just some pie-in-the-sky idea for Jesus. After all, he was well acquainted with enemies. He lived under the Roman occupation, and those enemies would eventually kill him. So when he said this, he assumed that in life we would have enemies. And then he taught us how to deal with them and offered a different way. Now, for those of you that were here last week, we talked a little bit about how the paths of Christianity and Buddhism diverge a little, at times, for sure, and they do when it comes to loving enemies and to seeking justice. In Christianity, we are called to seek justice, to cry out on behalf of the oppressed. In Buddhism, in the purest sense, there is not a theory of justice because there is no attachment to outcome. Action is called for without seeking the fruit of action. In progressive Christianity, we say, if you want peace, work for justice. In the socially engaged Buddhism of Thich Nhat Hanh, he says, if you want peace, be peace. And that is an end in itself. In other words, contemplation is the action. Do you see the different priorities? That's why we need each other. That's why we need each other. Because both of these great teachers are trying to help us with, is there a way out of living our lives as a series of battles? Now, maybe that speaks particularly to me because I'm Irish and I love a good fight. It's true. I have kind of a gladiator approach to things. But both spiritual teachers remind us and remind me that the work is internal. The work is internal. Don't you hate that? When Jesus on the Sermon on the Mount later on in that text says, resist not evil, I want to suggest that he's saying that about our own selves. In other words, inviting us to genuinely accept all of our negative emotions and our shadow side, because those things in us have a lot to teach us. And when we pretend they're not there, then we don't deal with them. We don't do the internal work that is required to become our highest selves. We're not very good at that in this country. In fact, we're a blaming society. Exhibit A, government shutdown. Right? I mean, it's the back and forth of blame, 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 blame. But here's the truth. When I am occupied with blaming, there is absolutely no space to look at my own complicity in things. It's so much easier to do this than to do, you need help. Am I the only one that has that struggle? So it is with our enemies. They have much to teach us. To love our enemies does not mean to condone or indulge or be enslaved mentally by them. But let's make it real for a moment. Love your enemies. Who is your enemy? What comes to mind? Let's make it even more real. Maybe take out the word enemy for a moment. Who is the other to you? Maybe in this day and age, it's easier for us to really start with, because I don't know about you, but I feel like I'm a kindergartner when it comes to loving my enemies. That we start with loving the other. So let me ask, who is the other to you? Now, to love is not a warm and fuzzy feeling, but to love the other is to attend to listen to be ready to understand, to accept as fully human. And when I say who is the other, I'm not talking about someone who might simply annoy you or get under your skin. When I talk about who is the other, I mean, who is it difficult for you and I to see as fully human? Their full humanity with their dreams and desires. To love the other takes opening our heart, which is a spiritual practice. To love the other means letting go of our defensive posture. To love the other means to be curious, to wonder. What is your story? Not, what is your story? To love the other means, at times, to offer forgiveness. Jesus said of his enemies, in the act of crucifying him, God forgive them, they know not what they do. Why? Because they were part of the war machine of the Roman Empire. They were caught up in the cogs of violence and oppression. They didn't make up the system, but they were caught up in it. So asleep to their own humanity that they violate his. So he says, they know not what they do. Buddha said to understand everything is to forgive everything. And to forgive means I might see something in you that is the same in me if I am willing to look honestly enough at myself. Think with me. Let's keep it real. Think with me for a moment of those people, the federal workers who work in our detention systems, our detention centers. Take a moment and let's ask, what is it doing to those who have to separate children and then to get a paycheck for that because maybe that's the only job they can get? To then, with that paycheck, go home and feed and shelter their own children. Is somebody with me in the room? Imagine. That dehumanizes them In the same way, it dehumanizes the families that are separated. And we all know that this family separation is in no way over. We know that, right? What does it do to their humanity? The people who are ordered to do that are the cogs in a machine. And then if we want to get really honest, we say, how are we complicit too? To really forgive is to resist making a person the other. I know a little bit about Jorge's experience at the border. I think that many of you know that he was treated much differently than the other clergy who got arrested. That this Latino clergy man was the one with his face in the dirt and a knee on his back, standing in nonviolent, peaceful protest. It's hard not to make that border guard the other. It's hard not to make him the other when he made Jorge the other. And I love Jorge. I don't particularly love him. But that's making it real. Not condoning that behavior in any way. But to other that border guard is to fall into the same machine that got us where we are now. Could be a good spot to say yup. Martin Luther King Jr. followed the radical teachings of the revolutionary prophet Jesus. He practiced loving his enemies, and he had plenty of them. When he was on his tour with his book, Stride Toward Freedom, a woman pushed her way through the crowd and asked her, "You Mr. King?" And when he said he was, she said, "I've been looking for you for 5 years." She brought out a sharp object from her purse and thrust it into his chest. Now, clearly, she was a troubled woman. King was rushed to the hospital, and after surgery, which removed a rib and part of his breastbone to free the Japanese letter opener leaning against the main artery of his heart. I know many of you know this part of the story, that his physician said that if he had sneezed, the letter opener would have punctured his artery, and he would have bled to death. And a little girl heard that story and wrote him a letter and just said, "I thank God you didn't sneeze." But coming out from sedation, his first words were, "Don't do anything to that woman. Help her get healed." He walked his talk because he believed with every fiber of his being that darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that. What kind of love is that? Well, it can simply start with something that Tavis Smiley, the broadcast journalist and author, deeply influenced by King, as he was giving an educational speech on the educational system, talked about love. He said, "Love simply means that everybody is worthy just because. All life has equal and precious value just because. Everybody's somebody's child, somebody's kid, and all life is equally worthy just because. Not because of where you went to school or how many degrees you have or what kind of car you drive or how much you make or who you know or who your mama and them know. None of that matters. Love means no one's humanity should be contested just because." If we treated everyone in America as worthy just because, what a different nation we would be. So, beloved community, maybe this is the dream that everybody's worthy just because. Maybe that's at least a step in the right direction toward loving the other, that everybody matters just because. My colleague this week challenged me. He said, "We get so caught up in issues that we forget to dream." And that spoke to me so deeply. Because I can confess to you, because you know me well after all these years, that I can get so passionate about the issues and about the injustice that's going on that I forget to dream. Dream of what could be, rather than simply fight what is. We are called to take up the Christian path to love the other, and it starts with our internal work. And part of that work is also to remember to dream. So I leave you with the dreamer himself. His words from his AFL-CIO 1961 speech. "Someday we shall bring into full realization the American dream, a dream yet unfulfilled, a dream of equality of opportunity, of privilege and property widely distributed, a dream of a land where men will not take the necessities from the many to give luxuries to the few, a dream of a land where men will not argue that the color of a man's skin determines the content of his character, a dream of a nation where all our gifts and resources are not held for ourselves alone, but as instruments of service for the rest of humanity. The dream of a country where every person will respect the dignity and worth of every human person. That is the dream. And we will struggle to make racial and economic justice a reality, but let us maintain faith. We will confront difficulties and frustrating moments in the struggle to make justice a reality, but we must believe somehow that these problems can be solved. So there's a little song we sing in the movement taking place in the South, and it goes like this: "We shall overcome."